So think about it this way. How does he literally fight inflation? Because everybody says tight money policies. And how do you fight inflation? The way that happens is you get people to spend less by taking money and credit away from them. So he will reduce the amount of money and credit that's available. The Federal Reserve is going to sell $1.1 trillion of debt that it has, debt assets, bonds. And then they're going to raise interest rates. So they create a squeeze that reduces demand at the same time as people don't have enough money because inflation is high. The buying power is less. And then what that act is to reduce buying power again to reduce inflation, but it comes at a big cost, and that is stagflation. I want to explain inflation in a very simple way. There's a certain quantity of buying, that is of how much money and credit you're given, divided by the amount of quantity of goods and services sold. In other words, if there's a lot more money and credit produced than there is goods and services produced, you will have an inflation, and the magnitude will be a function of that ratio. Over that period of time, there was a very enormous amount of money and credit that was produced, and there were some bottlenecks and shortages of production and disruption because of mostly of a combination of COVID and also geopolitical issues. So there was some effect. Most of the inflation came from the production. We attribute it. We can go down to actually calculate it. Most of that was due to the enormous increase in money and credit and spending that was produced. If you now look at the United States, it's no longer dominant militarily. It's no longer dominant economically because China has become comparable and is a larger trading partner with other countries than the United States is, the amount of trade and so on. It's a very unique power. Think about it. You can print the money that the world will accept. Now that means when they accept it, they buy your bonds, they buy your debt. That's what they hold these in, which are promises to receive this currency that you can print. So there are two things now that are jeopardizing that position. Dollar's now strong. Two things that threaten it. First is the printing and devaluing money, but all countries right now are doing it. So in all countries, currencies are depreciating against goods and services prices. And then the other issue, which is interesting, is the weaponization of the dollar in the form of sanctions. America is certainly in relative decline. In other words, has been. Education is not the same. Military power is not the same. Economic power is not the same. If we're looking at, how we're behaving with each other, it is not the same. This is the question. All currencies, usually during these period of time, depreciate together. So in the 1930s, all the currencies depreciate. They depreciated then against gold. They depreciate against assets, against real estate prices and a number of things. But we're coming into a new world in which the real question is what will be the new currency? And it may not be just a government currency. Is it crypto? Is it gold? Is it other things? And we'll find out. So a currency is a medium of exchange, and we'll have all of those currencies continue to be, including the dollar. But it's also a storehold of wealth. And that means that the bonds, or what you store it in, has to have a real return. And none of the major currencies have that. That's why you're seeing movements out of all of those and into other assets, and why you're seeing the bond market sell off. The production is now going based on ideological and political considerations. In other words, I talked about self-sufficiency. If you look at China will be self-sufficient. The United States will be self-sufficient. Multinational companies are going to worry about where they're going to have trade and so on. So the notion of how do I deal with self-sufficiency? We're in a world where ideological and political forces are allocating resources more than economic. Given the risks in the world, they want to be self-sufficient. And similarly, the United States wants to be more self-sufficient, and other countries are wanting to be more self-sufficient because they're worried about being cut off. It's the nature of the beast. Capitalism is a fabulous way of allocating resources to get rich, but it gets people at different rates. They get very big differences, and also produces a lot of debt. That's part of the capitalist process. And so when there's this large debt and when there's a large wealth gap, people feel disenfranchised. So it happened in Europe. 4 major democracies chose autocracies because of the fight between the left and the right. Then they called it fascism and communism. But those two, the right and the left, and how to deal with it has always happened. So you go back to the French Revolution, but the polarity becomes greater. When the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. You know how it is. How did Donald Trump get elected? What was the characteristics of the population? You can go back and you could see that. So you have fighters on both sides who
do not want to compromise.
They don't want, it's considered weak. And if you're in the middle, you will have to pick a side and fight. There's the loss of the middle. What we need right now, in my opinion, is a strong middle. You need a strong middle, but you also have a political system where you have two parties. And because of those two parties, there's a tendency to become more and more extreme because those extremities on each part of their party become stronger to win a nomination. Measures of extremism is that, roughly speaking, about 30% of the population is rather extreme of the right, and about 15% is extreme of the left. Of course, that represents then the majority of the Republican Party is in that category, and then a very important part of the Democratic Party is
on the left.
Yet the majority of Americans are in the middle. So you still have, given those numbers, they add up to maybe 40 or 45% of the population. You don't have a middle. Investing in education and infrastructure through history have been the most important ingredients. You can't make better investments than in education and infrastructure. They pay, and they produce a more broad-based prosperity. But we don't do that because of certain reasons, the Constitution and the like. But in order to do that, you need a platform of the middle. You need a spokesman, I think, that draws people away from the extremes toward the middle. If you did have a third political party, and I'm not saying that's practical, but I would say then you could have a platform, and then you could have somebody that you could look at, or candidates that say, I am for the middle, and that would help to neutralize. Because otherwise, history has shown you go to greater and greater extremism, and then you have the battle. And I think that that's what we should be afraid of most, is that those extremists in a battle having a type of civil war, which I think there's a reasonable chance of. When I say a civil war, I think that the rule of law and constitution can be of diminished value relative to power, such as in the elections, neither side accepting losing, such as the Supreme Court makes rulings that are not followed by states, such as population moving from one state to another because the values in that other state are more there. So then it becomes a make me type of situation. Rather than saying, what is the law? It says, make me do that thing. And now when we lose that kind of rule of law and respect for the whole, I think that's a type of civil war. When you watch that, who knows where that leads? It could lead to violence. You know, the whole idea in the Constitution of holding arms, you know, and how many, there are more arms than there are people, and so on. And when you get into a make me mentality, you could get into an armed situation where a lot of people and guns and crazy things. I'm not going that far, but I'm saying could. Let's bring that back a notch and talk about, can we imagine, you and I, we know history, and we look at today, and it's different. Could we see the failure of following the rule of law and the Constitution? So somebody gets elected and you now know who's going to be in the seat, or you don't follow that? Yes, there's a possibility. And the fact that we consider that to be a significant possibility, I put the odds of something like that at about 40%. History has also shown, and we see it, that people have to pick a side. They pick a side and they speak to it. So you watch in the media, do you get unbiased reporting? You know, it's hard to come by. Even exchanges of thoughts. It wasn't like this. Even the issue, let's say, of, Disney in Florida. In the past, each could have a different perspective. You wouldn't weaponize. You wouldn't retaliate to the same extent that we're retaliating with exercises of power and so on. You have to benefit the majority of the people. It's narrowing just by any of the measures since 1980. Per capita income for the bottom 60% of the population has not risen. If you ask your surveys, it's a failure. Every system needs to be improved and modified and made better. And I'm a mechanic, so I just look at the cause-effect relationship. It is because there is an element in which the reinvestment of gains do not go down to create the basics. What are the basics? Here's all you need. Parents who take good care of you, a good public education system, and equal opportunity. That's all you need, as existed throughout history. You give those things to people, and by and large, you have a much more prosperous, you could draw the talent from wherever it is. So those are the things. And we're in a spiral, because also the children who grow up in some of these areas from childhood, and they don't have the parents, they don't have the circumstances in terms of the basic equal education and so on. And that population is a growing population. And so we see then the disenfranchised. other issues is because that population. So let's just go back. How did Donald Trump get elected as president? There was a population that was a disenfranchised population that wanted somebody who was going to fight for him, like populists do. The profit system alone is not good enough. The history of these situations make one worry about such things because the conflict and so on goes through a difficult time. I believe that we're at a moment in which we have a choice, and it largely depends on how we are with each other.
We being Americans.
Americans, and then we being, it could be Americans and Chinese, but we as humans have a choice of how we are going to be with each other. The world has more resources than it has ever had. It has more wealth than it has ever had. It has inventiveness that will produce fabulous gains, and that'll continue. But the issue is really, are we going to be dealing with that as a together society? It's very simple. Don't go to war with each other. Work together, right? Don't go to war. If you do that and you realize we're all in this together, and then I don't care how you get there in terms of that element. I do believe in thoughtful disagreement, of the art of thoughtful disagreement. I believe in win-win relationships, not lose-lose relationships. And my principle is, if you worry, you don't have to worry. And if you don't worry, you need to worry.
You need to worry.
Because if you worry, you will do the things that prevent you from happening the thing you're worrying about. So, for example, if I look at the term civil war, and I look at the term international war, and I can paint a picture, a realistic picture of what that looks like, so the people really see it, like the people who went through those wars in history saw it. So I learned the lesson. But I like to do it as though I'm going through the real experience. I like to not read history in retrospect, but read the papers as things are transpiring and imagine that I'm going through it. So elements, I think, of a currency that I think that are important is, can you buy and sell things all around the world with it? Is it going to be private currency, that you're not dependent on others? Like gold, one of the things about gold is it has intrinsic value. So because of that, it's perceived intrinsic value, but you're not looking for a payment for somebody. Whereas in others, you have to have money coming in some exchange, that the government can't control it. And we're in an environment now when you have a currency that's a threat. It's so good that it's a threat to the existing currency. Governments will outlaw it. And they have done that with Bitcoin in a number of places, including China. And I think that they have those vulnerabilities, the digital currencies, they have that. I have a tiny bit of it. There's always something new, and I really need to experience it. I need to learn about it, and I never know for sure that that's not the one that's going to be there. So I have a little bit in the portfolio. Because when you start to think about what are the currencies that have those qualities I'm talking about, that you can keep them, that you can go around the world and so on,